This is the Ever Vigilant Podcast with me, Joe Prim. This is a Commute cast, which means it is raw, unedited, and random thoughts on a single subject that I've recorded on my long commute. Today I'd like to talk about my thoughts on North Korea. But before I do, if you haven't listened to podcast number 10, which is a review of the open concept, please check it out. It's the whole reason I started this podcast, was to share this concept of open your mind, open your eyes, open your ears, open your mouth, open your heart, and open your arms. They're 6 very simple principles that are very hard to master. And if you would like to get in contact with me for any sort of feedback, I would appreciate it. My Twitter handle and Instagram are The Ever Vigilant, or you can hit me up on email at evervigilantpodcast@gmail.com. Okay, so here are my thoughts on North Korea. Again, anything that I say here, check it out for yourself. If I make a mistake, if I'm wrong on something, call me out on it. Let me know so I can make a correction. But to my full knowledge, anything that I share here is correct. Again, I'm driving. It's hard for me to look anything up. So, the first thing I want to say here is, these new reports on North Korea kind of came out of nowhere. We've been talking about North Korea since the beginning of the year, and in the years past, it seems like it got a lot more contentious once Trump came into office. I think there was a little bit of testing going on by North Korea. But things had really died down until this week, when all of a sudden we find out that North Korea can put tiny nukes on their missiles. My reaction nowadays to this sort of information is to completely not believe it at all anymore. The fake news is still the fake news. The intelligence agencies are still the same intelligence agencies that have been spewing this silly garbage for years and years. To me, this sounds a whole lot like how we were sold the bill of goods for Iraq. We were told by everybody that there were WMDs in Iraq. And years later now, Colin Powell has even came out and say that he regrets lying about that was the low point of his life. I see that happening here again, when there are way too many people excited about going to war with North Korea. Way too many people pounding their chest and chanting USA, USA, for me to feel completely comfortable about this. After what has happened in Syria and the United States arming ISIS and al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda and really awful, horrible people that were doing horrific things, beheading children and raping and abusing women, taking women for sex slaves. There was one instance where they took Christian children and threw them into commercial mixing bowls and turned the mixers on to crush the children to death and baked their parents in the ovens. these people that we were supporting, that our intelligence agencies were supporting with our tax dollars, we should be sickened by it. But once again, they're asking us to trust them that they have intel from a country that's completely closed off of some miniature nuclear bomb. Again, in a different world, or 20, 25 years ago, sure, I eat it up and believe it all. But the news media and the intelligence agencies, which are really one and the same, running their propaganda and running their misinformation campaigns, in my opinion, cannot be trusted. Could North Korea potentially have such technology? Yes, I acknowledge it. But at some point it becomes the boy that's crying wolf. At the end of the story, yes, there were wolves. But over and over and over again, we are lied to and fooled into believing a narrative that is not true. Let me go to two examples of dictators that were set up for regime change. Let's look first at Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was not a good man. In fact, he was a horrible man. But because he was such a horrible man, he kept that country of Iraq together and kept the fighting to a minimum. When he was questioned by the FBI after his capture, one thing that he said, and again I'm paraphrasing it, I can't look it up right now, was that when he made his claims to having chemical weapons and to working on nuclear weapons, it was being used as to slow down or stop his number one and number two enemies. He may have been completely wrong in his thinking, but the United States and the United Nations were not at the top of the list of his enemies. He was fighting off a lot of factions within his own country, and he needed to hold up that threat, that idea that he had chemical weapons to use on his own people, which he had in the past. And his enemy number two was Iran. And it was very important for him to hold up the front of being able to hold off Iran should another war start, or to prevent another war from starting between these two countries. So in the end, the United States and the United Nations called Saddam Hussein's bluff, stopped with his game playing of the UN inspectors, and invaded his country. 1 million people, 1 million Iraqis died in that war. In the end, was it worth it? What was accomplished? What has changed for the people of Iraq? What has changed for the people of our country? Example number two would be Omar Gaddafi from Libya. Another bad man. But unlike the propaganda and the way that Libya was painted to you and described to you by our country, Libya was a rather successful place. It was the richest country in Africa. They had schools, free schooling, free health care. Schooling, as a matter of fact, where if you were smart enough that you could bring your schooling and they would pay for you to go to school in the United States or in Europe because they wanted good doctors and smart people encouraged to stay living in their country and not all leaving. They helped finance housing for people in their country. They gave bonuses away to people that got married, and I believe also when they had children. There were problems there, but they were not selfish with their wealth. Omar Gaddafi is an example of what happens when you go along with what the UN and the United States demand. Omar Gaddafi gave up his limited nuclear program, gave up all his WMDs, all his chemical weapons, and what happened to him? In the end, he had the same exact fate of Saddam Hussein. Whether you played hardball like Saddam, or whether you went along with the United Nations and the United States, the result was the same. You were killed. So what's the difference between those two countries and North Korea? Nuclear weapons. And if it weren't for the nuclear weapons, or the threat of having nuclear weapons, North Korea would have been taken over years ago. So, on one hand, they need to uphold the lesson learned from Saddam Hussein, is that you need to uphold to keep your enemies at a distance. You need to uphold the illusion, even if it's just an illusion, that you are able to hold off an attack, or that you are able to hold your own in a war against superior powers because you have the threat of nuclear weapons. That's the lesson learned from Saddam Hussein, right? Or that's what we've learned from Saddam Hussein, that the reason why you want to keep up that facade, that you want to keep that up, could very well be because you're trying to keep yourself from being attacked. Self-preservation. And number two, we've learned that if you capitulate and you go along with the program, go along with what you're asked to do, if you go ahead and disarm, again, you will be replaced and killed. So either way, North Korea is looking at the potential to be killed, or at the very least be replaced, and his country being completely taken over. The other thing we have to look at is, if you go to war with North Korea, a country that you cannot have that great of intel on, if you did not have good intel in Iraq and good intel, an idea of what was going to happen in Afghanistan, then I do not see any possible way that you can have good intel coming out of a completely dark, electronics-free country like South Korea. Could I be wrong? Yes, I very well could be. If this were a Tom Clancy book, but it's not. If we were to go to war with North Korea and the leader, Jang Kim-il, knows that he's going to be replaced and be forced to, either way, be replaced, to have regime change, what would prevent him, what would stop him from going ahead and nuking South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, etc., Guam. What would prevent him from doing that? I don't believe that there is any way that you could take out all the nuclear weapons that he has at once. And even if you were able to take out the nuclear weapons, he has many regular weapons too. You have to realize North Korea has the 4th largest military in the world. They may not have all the new sophisticated equipment, but what they have for sure is numbers. And an attack on South Korea or bombing of Japan or any of the other islands in that region would, I would think, be probable. The other thing to consider is China shares a big border with North Korea. Last time we were butting heads with Korea, who jumped in? China. Why would you not think that China would jump in and have the back of Korea? It only makes logistical sense to them to have an ally there rather than let the United States take control of that country and that border. China is already upset with the missile defense systems that have been put up in South Korea. For them to let the United States invade or have some sort of ground war that close to their border in China, I just don't see that being allowed to happen. I do not think that China wants the United States that close and surrounding that border of China with weapons. I just cannot see them feeling comfortable with that. So I can only foresee them getting involved. And the same goes for Russia. Again, Russia has very good diplomatic ties with China. They have a lot of trade agreements, and they've been working on a lot of side projects, like their replacement for the SWIFT system, which has to do with transfers of money between countries. So they are definitely allied. And with Russia's response in Syria to the United States, and not minding getting involved in the Syrian war, and not even as a proxy war, not even using somebody else to do the fighting for them, they have personally got involved in that fight because they didn't like what was going on. And again, another country that does not like the United Nations and NATO putting more and more weapons on bordering countries to Russia, to think that they would be okay with the United States and with war going on that close to their country, with the potential to have another country, another border filled with weapons aimed at them. I just cannot see them sitting back and going along with it. They didn't sit back and go along with Syria. They're not going to sit back and go along with that. Another reason I don't foresee these two countries, especially China, going along with that is all of the oil and minerals that are in North Korea. Untapped resources of minerals and oil in North Korea. Do you think that China is just going to let the United States waltz in there and lay claim to that stuff? I don't think so. I just do not see that happening. So what ends up, where does that go? I know a lot of people are all for going after North Korea because of their threats. I kind of see their threats as a way to try to preserve themselves. And I'm not so sure that China's not whispering in their ear trying to get them to play that game and to play the United States for them. So what would end up being the cost? What would end up being the cost in lives? What would end up being the cost to economies? There is no way that we get into a war like that where it doesn't affect us here in the United States. People, I think, are used to watching wars on TV and having them not affect us whatsoever here in the homeland. We've been in wars for the last 15 years, and it has affected us very little here at home. Of course, everybody knows soldiers that have gone over there. Everybody knows family members or knows people who have had family members killed over there or injured or come back and committed suicide. We've all dealt with that. It's all touched us in that way. But other than that, it's not really touched us. It's not hit home. Like in World War II, where we had air patrol making sure people had their lights shut out at night, and everybody teaming up to recycle, and thousands and thousands of men being sent off to war. It's not been affected like it has not affected us in that way these last wars. I don't foresee another war, especially on that continent, not getting too big for us. And another thing, too, I've been thinking about is that if North Korea really wanted to harm the United States, there are many ways to do it. Through hacking, or if they wanted to use a nuclear device, why not have it smuggled into the country to North Korean operatives on this side of the border and set it off in a city? Or why not launch a small missile off of a cargo ship in the Gulf or on the east or west coast? Why shoot a missile all the way across the ocean to maybe hit California? To me, there's a huge risk involved that, number one, that you would shoot it off. It would be obvious that you shot it off and it didn't make it to its target, like many of their test missiles. The other thing is that everybody in the world would know that you had done that. Trying to find an ally after you did something like that would probably be next to impossible. But if you really wanted to attack the United States, there are enough vulnerabilities here that somebody like North Korea could have an enemy state-sanctioned attack on the United States. Something small scale, wouldn't have to be huge, but it could be totally anonymous. And nobody would know who did it or how it happened. If your only idea is to inflict damage on our country, you could do it. So I look at so much of this boasting and so much of these threats as just idle threats of somebody that is trying to prevent their country from being taken over and is afraid. Probably the biggest thing, though, that worries me about this whole North Korea thing is whether there will be a false flag attack. I can see that as much more possible than there being an attack from North Korea. There could be a small nuclear device planted somewhere, or an attack off of the coast, or some sort of cyber attack that could be a false flag that's used to go into a full world war, or just to clamp down on the United States here, on our citizens a little tighter. So on one hand, this rhetoric of North Korea doesn't make me really worry about North Korea. If North Korea were such a threat, I don't think they would need to be trying so hard to build it up. But what actually makes me nervous, it makes me pause, it makes me have to think, is the idea that the deep state, the term that has become super popular, could do something, either as an aversion or a way to get rid of President Trump. So my advice is stay on your toes, check your preps, keep an eye on the situation and what's going on. Hit your knees, pray for your protection, for the protection of your fellow citizens, and that you would have wisdom to make the right decisions. And from there, there's not a whole lot more you can do. But sit back and see what happens. Keep up with your preps, buy some more food, Band-Aids, ammo, stock up, because even if there's just a fear of something happening, we know these prices will all go up quickly. So those were the thoughts that were on my mind today. That's what I've been thinking about. Let me know what you're thinking about and what your thoughts are on the situation. Again, Ever Vigilant, or The Ever Vigilant on Twitter and Instagram, or evervigilantpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. God bless. And remember the 3 F's: faith, family, and freedom. Thanks. Bye.